People often ask, do narcissists ever think about you after it's over? And the answer might surprise you. Yes, they do, but not in the way you think. See, narcissists don't actually forget you. That's not how their minds work. What they do is something more calculated and honestly more revealing. They bury you deep, out of sight, out of mind. But not because you meant nothing. Quite the opposite. You meant too much? More than their ego could handle. Here's why. Narcissists thrive on control, on being the center of gravity in your emotional universe. You were their mirror, their emotional supply. You reflected the version of themselves they wanted to see, adored, powerful, superior. But once you stepped away, once you started seeing clearly, you became dangerous to their illusion. You stopped feeding the fantasy. And that's when they start the burying process. They erase, discard, devalue, not because you didn't matter, but because remembering you threatens the fragile identity they've spent their lives constructing. Now, on the surface, they seem indifferent. They may even act like they never knew you. That's part of the performance. But the truth is, repression is not the same as resolution. What they push down eventually floats back up. And when it does, when they remember you fully and unfiltered, their ego doesn't just bruise. It cracks. Because here's the kicker, Ray. You were the one experience they couldn't fully control. You left an imprint. And no matter how many people they cycle through, no matter how many curated images they wrap themselves in, the memory of you exists like a glitch in their mental matrix. It doesn't align with the narrative they've created about themselves. Narcissists need a consistent story to survive psychologically. They're not adapting, they're protecting. And any memory of someone who saw behind the mask, who chose to walk away, doesn't fit. This is why that memory doesn't fade, it festers. It lingers in quiet moments, in failed comparisons, in the silence between relationships. They remember the control slipping. They remember your voice not bending. They remember you reclaiming your power. And every time they do, even if they won't admit it, even if they don't consciously realize it, that moment fractures their self-perception. From a psychological standpoint, this is called narcissistic injury. It's not heartbreak. It's ego damage. You see, narcissists don't truly bond. They attach for function, not connection. They idealize, devalue, and discard. And when that cycle is interrupted by someone choosing to walk away, or worse, thrive after them, it exposes the truth they've worked so hard to hide, that they're not invincible, that they can be forgotten, that someone else's life can actually get better in their absence. And that realization, it's unbearable because it doesn't just question the relationship, it questions their entire identity. Narcissists don't process pain the way emotionally healthy people do. They don't reflect, grow, heal. They defend, deny, deflect. So when a buried memory like you resurfaces, they don't lean into it. They panic. They project. They try to twist it into something that reinforces their self-image. But deep down, a part of them knows. And that knowledge that you escaped, that you saw them, that you no longer need them, is what starts to break the illusion. Philosophically, this is what happens when falsehood collides with truth. The narcissist lives in a reality built on image and projection. You were reality, you were the moment of truth, and truth has a way of echoing long after the lie has ended. So no, they didn't forget you. They remembered you every time they had to fake being whole. Every time they told a story where they were the victim and you were the problem. Every time they scanned a room and didn't see your reflection smiling back at them. Let that sink in, because their ego doesn't break when you leave. It breaks when they remember you, not as a victim, not as a chapter, but as the proof that their power was never real to begin with. And that's where you win. Because you didn't just survive them. You became unforgettable. You might think that when you walk away, all you're doing is reclaiming your own space, because you are. But there's something else unfolding behind the scenes. Your absence becomes a mirror that forces the narcissist to confront exactly what they've lost. In a relationship with a narcissist, you're more than a partner, you're their emotional supply line. You feed them admiration, validation, the illusion that they're powerful and irreplaceable. But the moment you step away, that supply is cut off. Suddenly, in the silence you create, they're faced with an empty vessel where your reflection used to be. And that emptiness, that nagging void, is a mirror held up to their true selves, something they've spent a lifetime avoiding. When you first stepped back, they probably reacted with indifference or rage, as though your departure was just another predictable chapter in their story. But underneath that surface performance, a different process was already underway. Without you there to reinforce their narratives, without you cheering them on, without you gaslighting yourself to believe they matter, they experience a sense of deprivation. It isn't simply missing you as a person, it's missing the role you played in sustaining their fantasy, and in that deprivation, something fragile inside them starts to tremble. Think about it philosophically for a moment. A narcissist constructs a personal mythology, a narrative about who they are, why they deserve admiration, and how they are the hero in every scenario. You, to them, were a key character in that mythology, the adoring audience member whose applause validated their greatness. Then you vanish, and the narrative loses its coherence. Without your applause, they're left onstage under glaring lights, hearing nothing but silence. It's as though they've been reading a script with missing pages, and no matter how hard they try to improvise, the story falls apart. Your absence is that missing page. It prevents the performance from continuing, and instead of discovering a new plotline where they're still in control, they're forced to face the uncomfortable truth their story was never as solid as it seemed. From a psychological perspective, this moment of reflection can feel existentially threatening. Narcissists aren't known for introspection. Quite the opposite. Self-awareness means confronting flaws, weaknesses, the possibility that their value might be contingent rather than intrinsic. When you leave, you not only withdraw your emotional energy, but also remove the projection surface they've used to avoid self-scrutiny. In their mirror, Instead of the grand, untarnished image they've carefully cultivated, they see a hollow outline. They see the cost of their manipulations, the casualties of their self-centeredness, and worst of all, the part of themselves they've refused to acknowledge, the part that depends on others to feel real. So in that moment of absence, their mirror shatters. They're forced to look at pieces of themselves they can't glue back together easily. But it's more than just seeing their own emptiness. It's recognizing that the emptiness couldn't be filled by anyone else. They may try to replace you, texting old acquaintances, swiping on dating apps, orchestrating that grand social media comeback. Yet with every new attempt, the void remains. Because you didn't just fill a role, you exposed the role itself as false. You showed them that if someone consciously chooses to be absent, to refuse participation in the toxic dynamic, their illusion loses credibility. And once an illusion is exposed, it doesn't just revert to its prior form, it crumbles. Their desperate efforts to fill the void only highlight how deep it runs. In that fractured reflection, they see more than the absence of you. They see all the other absences, the gaps they've patched with lies and manipulations. They see the relationships they've hollowed out. Friendships governed by utility, romances dominated by control, every connection veiled by performance. And now, without you there to uphold the lie, it's impossible for them to pretend those gaps aren't real. That kind of realization isn't just painful, it's destabilizing. Because their core belief is that they're untouchable, that no one can truly walk away and leave them diminished. Your absence proves that belief false. So yes, in that silence you create, your absence literally reflects their inner void. But you also awaken them to the fact that every other reflection they've trusted was a distortion. They've been looking for legitimacy and applause when what they needed was genuine empathy, a mirror not to reinforce their ego, but to show them who they truly are. And because they never learned to stand in that kind of mirror, they end up broken by the one that you hold up when you're gone. This is why your absence is powerful. It's not a passive withdrawal, it's an active revelation. You don't just leave, you show them the unadorned truth. You force them to reckon with the fact that they can't spin the story anymore. And while they'll never admit it, that confrontation is exactly what makes your absence so unbearable for them. It corrodes their defenses, undermines their narratives, and forces a reckoning with their own emptiness. You might wonder, then, what you can do with that knowledge. The most important thing is to embrace your absence confidently. Don't leave space for doubt by wondering if you did something wrong or by asking for forgiveness. The clarity you create through absence is itself a gift to yourself, yes, but also to anyone who has eyes to see. It draws a line between illusion and truth, and it sets a standard for how you, and everyone around you, deserves to be treated. In the end, their mirror may crack, but yours remains whole because it's grounded in authenticity. Your absence is the overdue reckoning the narcissist never asked for but desperately needed. And in the echo of that silence, you're not just missing, you're the catalyst for their awakening. Because when someone who thrived on your presence can't stand the mirror of your absence, you know you've shattered a lie, and in doing so, you've set yourself free. Let's clear something up that a lot of people get wrong. When a narcissist remembers you, they're not remembering as love. They're not reminiscing about the connection, the late night talks, or the shared dreams. That's not how they operate. What they're remembering is control, the dynamic, the leverage, the power they held over, or thought they did. See, for narcissists, relations aren't about intimacy, they're about dominance. You weren't a partner. You were a role player in a script where they were always the lead. And when you step out of that script, when you stop playing along, you force them to face the fact that you weren't actually under their control. You were choosing to be there. That realization doesn't just sting, it destabilizes their entire worldview. Let's take it deeper. In a healthy relationship, memory is tied to emotional meaning. We look back on someone and feel connected because there was mutual vulnerability, shared growth, real affection. For narcissists, memory isn't emotional. It's strategic. They remember how they positioned you. They remember when you admired them, when you gave in, when you stayed quiet instead of speaking up. Those are the scenes they replay, not because they miss you, but because they miss the feeling of superiority they had when you were there. This is why when they remember you, it's rarely from a place of loss. It's from a place of disruption. You were a system they thought they mastered. And then suddenly you weren't. You started asking questions. You set boundaries. You stopped letting them rewrite reality. And that shift wasn't just inconvenient. It was a threat. Because narcissists live in a psychological structure built around control. It's not just how they relate to people. It's how they feel safe. Now, here's the wild part. Even if they moved on, even if they've got a new relationship or a new group of admirers, that memory of you lingers. Why? Because you broke the pattern. You challenged the script. You stop giving them the power they expected, and that moment becomes like a glitch in the system, a reminder that their control isn't guaranteed. That maybe, just maybe, it was all an illusion to begin with. It's important to understand that this isn't personal in the way we usually think about relationships. Narcissists don't connect to people, they connect to roles. And your role was valuable to them because it reinforced their identity. The moment you stopped feeding that, you became more than just someone who left. You became proof that their dominance has limits. That's what really haunts them. Philosophically, this hits on something deeper. There's a human need for certainty, for predictability. For narcissists, that need gets twisted into a craving for control. They don't just want connection, they want confirmation of their importance. And when you disrupt that, you aren't just ending a relationship, you're disrupting a belief system. That's why your memory carries so much weight for them. It's not about you. It's about what you represented, the boundary they couldn't cross, the power they couldn't maintain. Think of it this way. They don't remember you like a person remembers a loved one. They remember you like a chess player remembers a game they didn't win. It sticks with them, not because they lost you emotionally, but because they lost their advantage. And narcissists hate losing, not because of the loss itself, but because it reminds them they're not as powerful as they pretend to be. So when they remember you, it isn't wistful, it's defensive. They try to reframe it in their mind. Maybe they tell themselves you were too sensitive or you were never really loyal. That's all part of the coping. It's easier for them to twist the story than to face the truth you saw through them and you walked away. And no matter how they spin it, that memory doesn't go away. But here's the part you need to own away. They don't remember connection because they were never capable of real connection in the first place. What they lost wasn't love. It was access. Access to your time, your energy, your belief in them. And when that's gone, what they're left with is a hollow reminder of the control they once held and the fact that they'll probably never have it again. And that's your power. Because in the end, the narcissist's ego doesn't break over love lost. It breaks over power denied. You weren't just someone who mattered. You were someone who couldn't be mastered. And that's what they'll never forget. Here's something narcissists never prepare for: your growth. Not just that you moved on, but that you evolved, that you healed, that you became more without them. Because in their mind, they were always the defining factor. They believed you needed them to function, to feel whole, to matter. And when they remember you, not broken, not desperate, but thriving, it doesn't just bother them. It breaks them. This is where the ego gets hit hardest. Because for the narcissist, identity is tied to control. If they could keep you small, dependent, doubting yourself, they felt powerful. But your growth exposes the lie. You weren't weak. You were suppressed. You weren't broken. You were surviving a system designed to keep you questioning your worth. And once you stepped outside that system and started rising, you rewrote the story they told themselves about who they are and what they meant. Narcissists rely on the idea that their victims can't truly live without them, that once the relationship ends, you'll crumble or come crawling back. So when you actually get better, you destroy that illusion. You confront them with a reality they can't manipulate, that their presence wasn't the best thing that ever happened to you. In fact, it might have been the very thing that forced you to awaken, to evolve, to stop settling. And here's the psychological piece that matters. Growth doesn't just challenge the narcissist's view of you. It threatens their entire self-concept. Because if you can get better after them, then maybe they weren't as valuable as they thought. If you can succeed, heal, laugh, love, and live without their influence, or worse, in spite of it, then the narrative they use to prop themselves up falls apart. And narcissists don't do well with narratives falling apart. They need to believe they are exceptional, not just to others, but to themselves. And your progress sends a signal that contradicts that belief. It says, you weren't my source of power. That is what cuts the deepest. Because they didn't just lose access to your attention, they lost access to the version of reality where they were central. Your growth reminds them that the universe doesn't revolve around them, that you are capable, that you were always capable. They just tried to convince you otherwise. Think about it: when you were with them, growth was discouraged. Any step toward independence was labeled selfish or disloyal. They resisted your goals, minimized your dreams, twisted your confidence into arrogance. Why? Because a confident, self-aware, empowered version of you is dangerous to someone who survives by controlling perception. Your growth takes away their favorite weapon, your doubt. So when they look back and see that you've changed, not into someone new, but into someone more you than ever, they feel exposed. Because now everyone else can see what they tried to keep hidden, that they were never the reason you shine. They were the shadow you had to walk through to reach your own light. And there's another level to this, philosophical but real. Growth is existentially unsettling to narcissists. It reminds them of what they're not doing. While you evolve, they repeat. While you self-reflect, they self-justify. While you embrace discomfort for the sake of healing, they avoid it to protect the image. So when they remember you, they're not just remembering someone they lost, they're remembering someone who changed. And by doing so, held up a mirror to everything they've refused to change in themselves. And let's be clear, they'll try to distort it. They'll say you got lucky, or you faked it, or you must be pretending. That's projection. Because if they admit it's real, they'd have to admit it's possible. And if it's possible, then they'd have to ask themselves why they're still stuck. They won't do that, but you don't need them to, because your growth was never about proving them wrong. It was about proving yourself right. Right to leave, right to heal, right to choose yourself. So if they remember you now, they don't just remember someone who walked away. They remember someone they couldn't stop, someone who rose, someone who reclaimed their story and refused to let it end on a lie. Let that be your legacy, because the most powerful thing you can become after a narcissist is free. And when they look back, your freedom will be the truth they can't unsee. There's something deeply ironic about the way narcissists process memory. You would think that someone who moves on so quickly, who replaces you without blinking, who posts the next relationship on social media like clockwork, would eventually forget you altogether. But that's not how it works. The truth is, the narcissist never truly forgets. And it's not because of love. It's because memory, for them, is a weapon. It's a tool they revisit when the illusion they've built around themselves starts to crack. Here's what happens. The narcissist crafts a narrative where they're always the hero or the victim, never the villain. In this story, you're rewritten, not as the person you really were, but as a symbol. A character in a script that exists to protect their ego. Maybe they paint you as the one who was unstable, ungrateful, or too sensitive, or maybe they pretend you never really mattered to begin with. Either way, they remember, but only through the lens that keeps them blameless. But here's the catchy: that narrative isn't built to last. Eventually, something slips, a relationship falls apart, an admirer sees through the charm, their performance starts to lose its audience. And in that moment of ego vulnerability, their mind reaches back to the one story they never fully resolved, you, because while they replaced your presence, they could never fully delete the disruption you caused to their control. You were the one that didn't collapse, the one that called out the lie, the one that walked. And what's more disturbing them than being left is realizing you never came back. That kind of unresolved break, where they didn't get to spin the ending, didn't get to reclaim power, festers like an unhealed wound in their psyche. And so they revisit it, not with clarity, but with distortion. They reopen the file not to learn, but to rewrite it again and again until the version they tell themselves feels safe enough to believe. But it never really works, because memory has a way of sneaking through the cracks of denial. And if you've grown, if your name comes up in conversations or your image surfaces online and you look happy, strong, grounded, that memory strikes a nerve. It's not their you they remember, it's the you they couldn't control. And that memory carries weight because it represents failure, not in the romantic sense. In the existential sense, you were supposed to stay in orbit around them, but instead you escape gravity altogether. Think about this from a psychological angle. Narcissists have poor object constancy. When someone isn't physically present to serve their needs, they often devalue or forget them emotionally. But this mechanism isn't perfect. It's a defense, not a deletion. The memory is still there, it's just distorted, and when triggered by loneliness, by rejection, by ego injury, it resurfaces sharper than before. That's when they might reach out, a text, a passive-aggressive message, a vague comment on something you posted. Not because they care, not because they've changed, but because they can't stand the reality you represent, that their version of the story isn't the only one, that you have your own story, and in yours, they lost. From a philosophical view, this taps into something bigger, the human fear of irrelevance. For narcissists, irrelevance is death. They need to matter, even if only in your memory. But you took that from them, not out of cruelty, but out of clarity. You decided not to carry them forward. And that decision haunts them, because it means their power was temporary, their influence limited, their story incomplete. So yes, they remember, maybe not the real you, but they remember the impact, the resistance, the end they didn't control. And that memory will always itch at their ego because they never got closure, never got redemption, never got you back under their thumb. But here's what matters more than their memory, your liberation from it. Because when you no longer need them to remember you accurately, or miss you honestly, or regret what they did, you win. Not in a petty sense, but in a deeper existential sense. You prove that your story isn't dependent on their version. You've authored your own ending, so let them remember. Let them sit with that distorted echo of who you were. Because as long as you continue forward, rooted in growth, grounded in truth, unbothered by the rewrite, you become the one thing they never expected, a memory they can't manipulate, a chapter they can't close, a reflection that keeps breaking the illusion. And that right there is power they'll never reclaim. And here's where everything comes full circle, because the final thing a narcissist never sees coming is this: your silence. Not the kind of silence that's passive or fearful, but the kind that comes from strength, from healing, from the decision to no longer engage in the performance. That kind of silence is not absence, it's resistance. It's you choosing peace over chaos, truth over manipulation, reality over illusion. And it is deafening to a narcissist. When you stop responding, when you stop trying to explain, fix, or even expose them, something unravels in their psychological framework. Because narcissists thrive on reaction. Your attention, even in anger or pain, feeds the illusion that they still matter in your world. But when the texts go unanswered, when the bait gets no bite, when your life moves on without any need to prove anything, they feel it like a void. A loss of control so sharp it cuts deeper than any confrontation ever could. See, narcissists are addicted to cycles. Idealize, devalue, discard, and hoover. Repeat. It's a loop that keeps them in control and keeps you confused. They depend on the idea that eventually they can get a response, maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. That threat of possible re-entry is what allows them to move on without truly letting go. And when your silence isn't temporary but permanent, they're forced to face the truth they spend their lives avoiding. You don't need them anymore. And more than that, you never did. It's not just about not replying. It's about no longer needing their validation. It's about not rehearsing imaginary conversations in your head, not checking their profile, not wondering what they think. True silence is psychological. It's when they no longer occupy space in your mind because you've reclaimed it for better things: growth, purpose, peace. And let's be clear, this isn't about revenge. Silence isn't payback. It's protection. It's you refusing to lower your frequency to match theirs. It's you finally understanding that explaining yourself to someone committed to misunderstanding you is a waste of your voice, and that your voice, when used in the right places, can change your life. But when used in the wrong places, it just echoes back distortion. Narcissists interpret silence in one of two ways. At first, they see it as a game. They'll poke and prod, try to get a rise out of you. They'll post things online to get a reaction, triangulate with others, test your boundaries just to see if they still exist. But when time passes and nothing changes, when you don't bite, don't chase, don't even flinch, that's when the ego cracks. Because now the silence isn't passive, it's power. And they know it. Psychologically, this is profound. Narcissists can't self-soothe. They regulate their emotions by controlling others, by getting reactions, by manipulating perception. When you deny them access to your emotional responses, you force them into a confrontation with themselves. And they don't have the tools to handle that. Your silence becomes a mirror, and what it reflects is everything they've been running from. Philosophically, this silence says something even deeper. It says that healing isn't loud. Growth doesn't have to perform. Power doesn't need to announce itself. When you get to the point where you no longer need the last word, you've already won the last battle, because you're no longer playing their game, and that alone rewrites the rules. They remember that. They carry it because most people argue, most people plead, most people want to be understood. But you didn't. You stepped back. You walked forward. And that silence, it told them everything, that you outgrew the need for chaos, that you reclaimed your energy, that you finally saw your own worth and decided to protect it. So when they remember you, and what echoes in their mind is not what you said, but what you didn't say, not the text you sent, but the one you never replied to, not the confrontation, but the piece you chose instead. Because in the end, silence isn't empty. It's full of everything they lost and everything you found.